It has never been easier to make music, but it has never been harder to become a successful young musician. Just think about it. When was the last time you heard a young person courageously say, "I want to be a rock star"? Many have noticed that guitar music isn't dominant anymore, but it's deeper than that. There's this weird apathy, a lack of hunger, a lack of vigor. And on paper, it doesn't really make sense because everything's stacked in our favour. Instruments are cheaper than ever. You can record professional sounding music on your laptop. Parents are generally more supportive of creative hobbies, and YouTube will literally teach you anything for free. So because of that, you might be wondering, why is it that fewer young people start bands and commit to music? Why is it that compared to the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, young people just aren't aiming high at all, and in a way, they kind of seem doomed? Today, I'm going to tell you about the things that might be stopping us. And as you can see, this isn't going to be a kids these days rant, because I am young, I am 19. And overall, it's just going to be a look into how schools, universities, money, the internet, record labels, etc. are affecting young people and their prospects in music. Alright, let's get to it. First of all, let's talk about schools, where you've got creativity versus constant pressure. In general, schools teach music less and less, and when they do, it's often an exam-based, analytical approach that doesn't necessarily reward creativity as it should. And overall, in the school system, you're always doing homework, revision, and having constant exams. And the dumb thing about it is that most of the information from most subjects that you learn is not useful in real life. In my experience, when trying to find other people to make music with, it was impossible. Everyone was busy, stressed, and preoccupied with something else, like the next exam that was coming up. It was just seen as something unimportant compared to schoolwork, and thus most were uninterested in playing in a casual band, let alone trying to develop instrumental skills or actually commit to music or take it seriously. And another thing is, in this system where you've got loads of work for loads of different subjects, there just isn't any time to be bored anymore. And by bored, I don't mean having no ideas and doing nothing. I mean those moments where you've got some peace of mind and you can actually come up with something creative, or in a way, sometimes when you've got nothing to do, you want to make use of that time and do something fun with it. It's just so rare nowadays to have a moment when not only you are free or doing nothing and actually have the initiative or idea to meet up and play together. It's really hard to find other people who are also free and not doing anything. It's just when you have a creative idea, that's when you start wanting to get other people involved, maybe to join and play and to hang out. So instead of doing nothing, you're using your time in a fun, creative way. To a certain extent, I would even argue that if someone really commits themselves to school, they just don't have the time to be a carefree teenager. And at that point, it's not even a concern about creativity, it's just not healthy for a young person. The next point I'd like to address is that there's actually a bit of a rebellion void. And by that, I mean that young people today aren't opposing old trends like they used to. Universally, most parents enjoy and continue enjoying the music from their youth when they get older. And especially regarding contemporary music from previous decades, like the 80s or the 70s or the 60s, the new styles that would emerge were completely different to the ones before, let alone a generation before the music young people's parents would have been listening to. Even to the extent that music that was enjoyed by youth was just regarded as noise. It feels like that's changed a lot today, as parents often listen to music from the 70s, 80s and 90s, and younger people often resonate with the same kind of vibes. And especially considering that there have been so many extreme genres already, it's not really hard to work out that there's nothing to rebel against for young people. Without any generational clash, there's no real reason to be rebellious. You'll most often see parents going to rock concerts of old stars with their kids, so in a way it's more compliant than ever before. On top of this, if you think about older generations, so people from their 30s, 40s, 50s, listening to the same music as people in their teens and 20s. The result of that is, especially considering how many legends there have been in especially rock music, like singers like Freddie Mercury or David Bowie, that when a young person starts to make music, the old generations have really high standards and can hold it to great scrutiny. And because of those high standards, it's just hard to please them. When you also factor in that their favourite music can be played at the push of a button on a digital device of their choice, things get even more difficult. So thinking about how the greatest music has often been propelled and made by going against what's been done before, you can kind of see the dilemma that some songwriters might have. There's not really the position for the same thing to happen today unless you do something really weird, but that might just be why there's nothing immensely innovative coming out. Nowadays, in the 21st century, when we've got internet and all the means of communication, it's harder to find friends than ever before. On paper, if you think about what social media was meant to do, you'd think it's meant to connect people more. But often it does the opposite. Instead of talking to the people around you, you text, you doom scroll, you check boring emails, and you end up glued to a screen in front of you. That detaches people from the world around them. Fewer relationships start, fewer conversations start, fewer bands start. Before phones and the internet, sitting at home was often painfully boring. Obviously, you still had TV, books, or maybe even a game console if you were lucky, but you can't really compare that to how almost everyone has infinite access to all the content and entertainment they'd ever like. You can get it wherever you want, you can get it whenever you want, as long as you have a digital device. So instead of swiping phones, people actually went out, and if they wanted to interact with others, they'd actually have to talk to them. And more in the context of music, musicians didn't have free YouTube backing tracks to play to, or tutorials to learn from. If you wanted to jam, you needed a band. And in turn, that starts a snowball effect where when you're around people that you often like, you actually start to have fun, you want to do something creative, and that's how songs are born. And without all the things in the internet that replaced that interaction that I mentioned, there genuinely was a demand for people who could play, drummers, guitarists, vocalists, to actually start a band and play music. And one could also go on and on about how the value of music has been reduced, but also considering that the value of a young, inexperienced musician has plummeted with the presence of this content that can just replace them. And especially in an environment like a girls' school that I went to, it just felt impossible to start a band. And then again, someone can just come up and say, "Oh no, you're wrong, you can find band members online." Let's just stop and be realistic. Think about it. Those people are often between their 20s and 40s. And then look at most great musicians that have existed and think about how they were often 15 or 16 when they started playing, when they were inexperienced and starting to gain experience. In all seriousness, would you think that putting an inexperienced 15-year-old in a band with members who are potentially 30 or 40 is a logical or sensible option? It's obviously not. And that's not just because a 15-year-old isn't experienced enough or good enough at playing their instrument most often. That would just be an uncomfortable space for them, and they'd only be accepted in if it were just a bunch of creeps playing gigs on tropical islands. But yeah, getting back to the point, bands usually form when people are at the same age more or less, have similar musical tastes, and often are friends already. But now we come back to today and we think, what if no one plays the instruments you'd need to have a rock band? What if everyone listens to totally different music? Or worse, what if you're surrounded by the crowd that says, "I listen to everything," but just end up lukewarm and quite passive? Genre fragmentation. Young people today have no shared musical dream. Developing from the last point, if you think about it, young people have never been so divided in terms of what they listen to. Back in the 50s to the 90s, people didn't just listen to a band, they were part of a movement. Rock, punk, metal, new wave, synth pop, new romantics, goth. These scenes shared a look, attitude and goal. Popular genres of music were all over the radio and TV, and there was a very limited number of channels or stations that you could listen to. Like for instance, in the UK, people had Top of the Pops, and later MTV came about. In a way, there was a bit of a cap or limit on what could have been hot at one time. A small number gave them more importance and national reach. That was what created youth subcultures. Today, everything is hyper niche. One person's into shoegaze revival, another into K-pop, another into lo-fi indie folk, another into retro disco. Then others might be into metal or some math rock subgenres. And the thing is, none of these are bad, they just don't push people together. And the effect of that, as I mentioned before, is that we don't have any more clear-cut youth subculture anymore. There's no communities that one wants to be a part of. It's just incredibly divided. And now, putting this into practice and looking at the results, it's not surprising that it's way harder to agree on what band you'd like to have, what type of songs you'd want to write, or even imagine the same future or goals you want to reach. I personally can't think of any new guitar trend that started within the last 20 years. University. Is it a dream maker or breaker? More people than ever go to university, so that sounds perfect for starting bands. Or is it? When you think about uni, it's supposed to be a place for young people that's a social hotspot, a place where they can learn something that they're really passionate about and develop in the direction that they always wanted. But in reality, it's not hard to guess that most people choose degrees that will lead to stable, well-paying jobs, ideally. So economics, maths, biology, medicine, etc. And in terms of music, in traditional universities, you really don't have much of it. And a lot of musicians end up going to conservatoires or college that specialise in music. So you might still find a lot of great social interaction there. But for many that go to a typical university that maybe doesn't even offer music as a subject to study, for them, that just means more heavy workloads, content to revise, and endless exams. People just end up exhausted, and then when it actually comes to free time, they'll choose to go clubbing or do something more relaxing rather than adding extra chores like organising a band. And what if you already had a band before uni? Well, most likely you're miles and miles apart from each other. To an extent, one can argue that after coming out of those campuses, young people can come out a bit decadent from all the clubbing. Some might be semi-alcoholics if they really take it far. And everyone's got the burden of a massive debt that they're not going to pay off, most likely within the next 20 years. Now, that doesn't really put one's mind in a clear, in a way, happy-go-lucky, winner's attitude where someone says, I want to be a rock star. The prospect of likely feeling a bit lost and even jobless for a while doesn't really give you the winner's attitude that you'd need to get far. Fortuitous funding. In the 1970s, many musicians, in the UK at least, were on the dole. And for those who don't know what that means, it means they were claiming welfare or benefits for unemployment. Clearly, that's not something to romanticize, but it created a very specific environment that relative financial security gave people the time to go play in a band, organize rehearsals, and when they created songs, they had this headroom for creative risk. That's the leap of faith anyone needs to take to be able to create anything new. If you and your mates were on the dole and living in one area, you could easily meet up, have a laugh, and come up with something creative. In a way, that's what young people should be doing. Maybe not always full time. That's something that young people often have a need to do unless they're pressured to do something else. Later on, political changes pushed people into universities in a way to increase education and reduce the number of people who are both unemployed and not studying. But back then, if you were a musician, often you weren't sitting exams, hustling multiple jobs, or worrying about the cost of living. You had time to experiment, time to fail, and time to try something weird or new. That's the ultimate environment for creativity. Record labels don't build stars anymore. Record labels used to create artists. Now they select them. You're incredibly unlikely to get signed just because you're talented. Labels want a ready audience of followers and proof that you're marketable. And let's be real, many already have established artists, so why take risks? And here's another important point. Music used to be released physically. It was priced appropriately, and labels were raking in loads of money for it. That would allow them to have the money for talent scouts who would find the next big thing. And even if projects didn't work out, they had enough money to eat the losses and carry on. And often, failed projects could be offered another chance. Today, you only really get one chance. Once you fail, no one really wants to sign you. And if you consider that artists like David Bowie's first album were a flop, and Queen's also wasn't a commercial success, and think about how no record company would actually touch them with a barge pole after that, you can clearly see the problem. Many artists just don't really have a first great album, so cutting them off after that kills lots of creativity. Another example I can think of off the top of my head is Eurythmics. Their first album was just awful, but then ended up creating some revolutionary tracks. In the 70s and 80s, labels would invest huge amounts of money into anyone who actually had something interesting to say. Take for instance OMD. They were pioneers of electronic music in the UK. Their debut single from 1979 was literally titled Electricity, and that was really ahead of its time because it came before the avalanche of synth pop that would come after. Andy McCluskey and Paul Humphreys started out as a duo using backing tracks from their 4-track tape recorder, and eventually they sent their demo of Electricity to the presenter of Granada TV and co-founder of Factory Records, Tony Wilson. At first he wasn't really impressed at all, but other people were interested. I think it was his wife, and OMD ended up getting a one-off single from Factory Records. That momentum led them to signing a 7-album deal with Din Disc, which was worth almost $300,000. With that money, they built their own studio, got their equipment together, and ended up releasing quite a few good songs. In a way, that human aspect of belief and trust and hope for the future for those young people just doesn't really exist in labels today. Alright, let's hop back to where we were earlier and think about that hypothetical band you might have had in university. Say you weren't really miles apart, you stayed together, you played, you created some decent songs together, and you want to carry on for the future after uni. You graduate and you think you're free now, right? Now it's time to step it up. Nope. Reality check. Who's paying the bills? At this point, as I've mentioned earlier, you've got a student loan to be paying off, and wherever you live, even if it's with your family, you're going to want to at least contribute or have to. So that means you need a job. And today, jobs are harder than ever to get. So unless music already is your job, you don't really have time at this point. Fresh graduates not only have a hard time getting a job, but they often get low salaries. So overall, creativity loses to survival. And even if you try to argue that you've got Logic today, you can buy it for an affordable price, you can make great music in your bedroom, that's nothing compared to what people were getting before from record labels, working with professionals in real studios, having a whole marketing team, image team, looking after them. In a way, telling young people that they can just make professional sounding music in their bedroom, just like artists did before in studios, is honestly like telling someone they can make a brand new Mercedes out of scrap metal, glass, rubber, just basic raw materials without the knowledge of how to glue them together and actually make that beautiful product. And now, here's a really uncomfortable truth. The industry doesn't want real musicians anymore. If what I was talking about before just didn't convince you at all, here's the uncomfortable truth. Even if you have all the creativity in the world and all the talent anyone could wish for, record labels just aren't really interested in that anymore. Or at least not in the way we'd think about it. Let's go back to the 1950s. There wasn't really much technology, especially for post-production, adding effects, etc. For a record to sound good and professional, you needed musicians with skill. That's why you had such great singers in the spotlight. Their abilities were there not just to entertain you, but they were actually necessary for the recordings. As technology developed, musicians didn't necessarily need all those skills to create music. And additionally, musical styles evolved to incorporate elements that weren't reproducible by humans, like samples or really breathy or whispery vocals. Today, you're not really expected to be a musician in the full sense of the word. You're just one role. You're either a singer, a songwriter, a producer, or a backing musician. If you write, grow, want to experiment as an artist or even as a band with many people, It's just inefficient in the modern industry. And in a way, looking at how record labels operate, they're like corporations, where they might prefer someone with just a sweet face rather than someone who's actually an artist, because they're easier to control and manage that way. To a certain point, you can even look at today's artists as puppets that have a songwriter assigned to them, an image artist assigned to them, a producer assigned to them, lyricists and managers just creating them into a product. And if an artist gets too big-headed, they can be cancelled on the spot and replaced easily. It's just extremely efficient and expedient for the corpo entity. So in simple words, that's why we've got conveyor belt entertainment today, regurgitating the same sounds just with different faces. It's no longer a piece of music that expresses the soulful feelings of a group of young people or an artist. You can look at it as something cobbled up by a bunch of people just doing their job. Bands are just seen as messy, unpredictable, and inefficient to deal with. My guess is that it probably would have been some rehashed old unreleased Beatles tracks. And now, going back to the idea of being a product, let's look at female artists. I'm not going to say too much about them, but it's sad to think about how in performances, camera work always seems to be focused on parts of the body that you wouldn't exactly associate with the sound of singing. You might expect different sounds to come out of there. So even if you are talented and creative but just don't fit into that predefined role, you're not very useful to the industry. And that's not even criticism, that's just how it is. Any reminiscence of artistic integrity is just scrubbed out. Alright, now for the final point, the internet trap. And yes, I see the irony. Now, this is a moment where I have to be a little bit self-aware because I am a young person, I am on YouTube, and you're literally watching this through the internet. So yes, I am taking part in this, and YouTube has been a great place to discover different music and points of view about music. But still, that doesn't absolve the way the internet damages creativity as a whole. First, I want to talk about algorithm culture. For many, music isn't about their own identity anymore, it's about performance. What works, what trends, what gets clicks. That's what gets more reach, so that's what people do. And then there's fear of failure. Every bad performance, cringe moment, wrong note, things can be recorded, screenshotted, and judged forever. So instead of actually releasing music, people overpolish, overthink, fret about irrelevant things. You've just got this paralysis over perfection. People never finish their work. And then instead of starting bands, people just think, why do I need a band? I can do it all in my own bedroom. But bands aren't supposed to be about being perfect. They're about playing together and being alive. And you feel that when they are playing. Those imperfections make the music wholesome. And another thing you can talk about relating to the internet trap is how on social media, young people, especially guitarists, just become jukeboxes playing Stevie Ray Vaughan or Jimi Hendrix or other old musicians that other older guitarists tend to like. So at this point, you might ask, what's the recipe to break through? And potentially a young aspiring guitarist can sit down and look and most likely think that they'd have to be some sort of blonde woman with really revealing clothes, playing guitar in a bit of a half-assed manner and focusing and putting more effort into jiggling their bodily assets. Is that really what the world wants right now? So in a way, although you do have this amazing freedom where you can run your own channel or account about whatever you like, whatever you feel passionate about, the restriction is more so mental, where people fear low views, lack of reach, and just not getting the reception they'd really want. Sometimes if you do what you're actually passionate about, people just aren't interested. And naturally, that's because people come to the internet to consume, to be entertained. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just creatives tend to lose their identity when they're trying to get those views. Alright then, so just to conclude, are we actually doomed? It isn't really about young people being lazy today. It's about pressure, systems, algorithms that once made young musicians thrive. The tools are better than ever, but the environment is worse. And that's why young musicians kind of feel doomed. And so on that note, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And with that, I hope you found this video interesting. And if you'd like to support my channel, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like or sub. Thanks for watching, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Bye!